She was flying through blind darkness with Eddie's arm around her and Roland's hand squeezing her own. 16. When the darkness let them go, they were almost 40 feet down the road from the camp. Jake sat up slowly, then turned to Oi. "You all right, boy?" "Oi." Jake patted the bumbler's head. He looked around at the others, all here. He sighed, relieved. "What's this?" Eddie asked. He had taken Jake's other hand when the chimes began. Now, caught in their interlocked fingers, was a crumpled pink object. It felt like cloth. It also felt like metal. "I don't know," Jake said. "You picked it up in a lot just after Susanna screamed." Roland said, "I saw you." Jake nodded. "Yeah, I guess maybe I did, because it was where the key was before." "What is it, Sugar?" "Some kind of bag." He held it by the straps. "I'd say it was my bowling bag, but that's back at the lanes with my ball inside it, back in 1977. "What's written on the side?" Eddie asked. But they couldn't make it out. The clouds had closed in again, and there was no moon. They walked back to their camp together, slowly, shaky as invalids, and Roland built up the fire. Then they looked at the writing on the side of the rose-pink bowling bag. "Nothing but strike at mid-world range," was what it said. "That's not right," Jake said. "Almost, but not quite. What it says on my bag is nothing but strike at Midtown Lane." "Timmy gave it to me one day when I bowled at 282. He said I wasn't old enough for him to buy me a beer." "A bowling gunslinger," Eddie said, and shook his head. "Wonders never cease, do they?" Susanna took the bag and ran her hands over it. "What kind of weave is this? Feels like metal and it's heavy." Roland, who had an idea what the bag was for, although not who or what had left it for them, said, "Put it in your knapsack with the books, Jake, and keep it very safe." "What do we do next?" Eddie asked. "Sleep," Roland said. "I think we're going to be very busy for the next few weeks. We'll have to take our sleep when and where we find it." "But sleep," Roland said, and spread out his skins. Eventually they did, and all of them dreamed of the road. Except for Mia, who got up in the night's last dark hour and slipped away to feast in the great banquet hall. And there she feasted very well. She was, after all, eating for two. Part 2. Telling Tales. Chapter 1. The Pavilion. 1. If anything about the ride into College Bridge surprised Eddie, it was how easily and naturally he took to horseback. Unlike Susanna and Jake, who had both ridden at summer camp, Eddie had never even petted a horse. When he'd heard the crop of approaching hooves on the morning after what he thought of as Todas number 2, he felt a sharp pang of dread. It wasn't the riding he was afraid of, or the animals themselves. It was the possibility, hell, the strong probability, of looking like a fool. What kind of gunslinger had never ridden a horse? Yet Eddie still found time to pass a word with Roland before they came. It wasn't the same last night. Roland raised his eyebrows. It wasn't 19 last night. What do you mean? I don't know what I mean. I don't know either, Jake put in. But he's right. Last night New York felt like the real deal. I mean, I know we were Todas, but still real, Roland had mused. And Jake, smiling, said, "Real as roses." 2. The Slightmans were at the head of the college party this time, each leading a pair of mounts by long packs. There was nothing very intimidating about the horses of College Bridge Sturgis. Certainly they weren't much like the ones Eddie had imagined galloping along the drop in Roland's tale of long-ago mazes. These beasts were stubby, sturdy-legged creatures with shaggy coats and large, intelligent eyes. They were bigger than Shetland ponies, but a very long cast from the fiery-eyed stallions he had been expecting. Not only had they been saddled, but a proper bedroll had been lashed to each mount. As Eddie walked toward his, he didn't need to be told which it was. He knew the roan. All his doubts and worries fell away. He only asked a single question directed at Ben Fleischman, the younger, after examining the syrup. These are going to be too short for me, Ben. Can you show me how to make them longer? When the boy dismounted to do it himself, Eddie shook his head. It'd be best if I learned, he said, and with no embarrassment at all. As the boy showed him, Eddie realized he didn't really need the lesson. He saw how it was done almost as soon as Benny's fingers slipped up the syrup, revealing the leather tub and back. This wasn't like hidden subconscious knowledge, and it didn't strike him as anything supernatural either. It was just that, with the horse a warm and fragrant reality before him, he understood how everything worked. He'd only had one experience exactly like this since coming to Midworld, and that had been the first time he'd strapped on one of Roland's guns. Need help, Sugar? Susanna asked. Just pick me up if I go off on the other side, he grunted, but of course he didn't do any such thing. The horse stood steady, swaying just the slightest bit as Eddie stepped into the syrup and then swung into the plain black ranch hand saddle. Jake asked Benny if he had a poncho. The foreman's son looked doubtfully up at the cloudy sky. I really don't think it's going to rain, he said. It's often like this for days around Riptide. I want it for oil. Perfectly calm, perfectly certain. He feels exactly like I do, Eddie thought, as if he's done this 1,000 times before. The boy drew a rolled oilskin from one of his saddlebags and handed it to Jake, who thanked him, put it on, and then tucked Oi into the capacious pocket which ran across the front like a kangaroo's pouch. There wasn't a single protest from the bungler either. Eddie thought, if I told Jake I'd expected Oi to trot along behind us like a sheepdog, would he say he always rides like this? No. But he might think it. As they set off, Eddie realized what all this reminded him of. Stories he'd heard of reincarnation. He had tried to shake the idea off to reclaim the practical, tough-minded Brooklyn boy who had grown up in Henry Dean's shadow and wasn't quite able to do it. The thought of reincarnation might have been less unsettling if it had come to him head-on, but it didn't. What he saw was that he couldn't be from Roland's line. Simply couldn't. Not unless Arthur Eld had at some point stopped by Co-op City, that was. Like maybe for a red hot and a piece of Dolly Lundgren's fried dough, stupid to project such an idea from the ability to ride an obviously docile horse without lessons. Yet the idea came back at odd moments through the day and had followed him down into sleep last night. The elves. The line of the elves. 3. They nooned in the shadow, and while they were eating pumpkins and drinking cold coffee, Jake eased his mount in next to Roland. Oi peered at the gunslinger with bright eyes from the front pocket of the poncho. Jake was feeding the bumbler pieces of his pumpkin, and there were crumbs caught in Oi's whiskers. Roland, may I speak to you as Dean? Jake sounded slightly embarrassed. Of course. Roland drank coffee and then looked at the boy, interested, all the while rocking contentedly back and forth in the saddle. Ben, that is, both Fleischman, but mostly the kid, asked if I'd come and stay with him, out at the Rocking Bee. You want to go? Roland asked. The boy's cheeks flushed thin red. Well, what I thought is that if you guys were in town with the old fella, and I was out in the country, south of town, then we'd get 2 different pictures of the place. My dad says you don't see anything very well if you only look at it from one viewpoint. True enough, Roland said, and hoped neither his voice nor his face would give away any of the sorrow and regret he suddenly felt. Here was a boy who was now ashamed of being a boy. He had made a friend, and the friend had invited him to stay over, as friends sometimes do. Benny had undoubtedly promised that Jake could help him feed the animals and perhaps shoot his bow, or his bar, if it shot bolts instead of arrows. There would be places Benny would want to share, secret places he might have gone to with his twin another time. A platform in a tree, mayhaps, or a fish pond in the reeds special to him, or a stretch of riverbank where pirates of Eld were reputed to have buried gold and jewels. took places as boys go. But a large part of Jake Chambers was now ashamed to want to do such things. This was the part that had been despoiled by the doorkeeper in Dutch Hill, by Gasher, by the Tic-Tac man, and by Roland himself, of course. Were he to say no to Jake's request now, the boy would very likely never ask again, and never resent him for it, which was even worse. Were he to say yes in the wrong way, with even the slightest trace of indulgence in his voice, for instance, the boy would change his mind. The boy. The gunslinger realized how much he wanted to be able to go on calling Jake that, and how short the time to do so was apt to be. He had a bad feeling about Collard Green Station. Go with them after they dine us in the pavilion tonight, Roland said. Go and do your fine, as they say here. Are you sure? Because if you think you might need me... Your father is saying he's a good one. My old teacher. Court or Van A? Court. He used to tell us that a one-eyed man sees flat. It takes two eyes set a little apart from each other to see things as they really are. So I go with him. Make the boy your friend if that seems natural. He seems likely enough. Yeah, Jake said briefly, but the color was going down in his cheeks again. Roland was pleased to see this. Spend tomorrow with him, and his friends if he has a gang that goes about with. Jake shook his head. It's far out in the country. Ben says that Eisenhart's got plenty of help around the place, and there are some kids his age, but he's not allowed to play with them, because he's the foreman's son, I guess. Roland nodded. This did not surprise him. You'll be offered graft tonight in the pavilion. Do you need me to tell you it's iced tea once we're past the first toast? Jake shook his head. Roland touched his temple, his lips, the corner of one eye, his lips again. Head cleared, mouth shut. See much, say little. Jake grinned briefly and gave him a thumbs up. What about you? The three of us will stay with the priest tonight. I'm in hopes that tomorrow we may hear his tale. And see, they had fallen a bit behind the others, but Jake still lowered his voice. See what he told us about? That I don't know, Roland said. The day after tomorrow, we three will ride out to the Rocking Goose. Perhaps noon would tie Eisenhart and have a bit of palaver. Then, over the next few days, the four of us will have a look at this town, both the inner and the outer. If things go well for you at the ranch, Jake, I'd have you stay there as long as you like and as much as they'll have you. Really? Although he kept his face well, as the saying went, the gunslinger thought Jake was very pleased by this. Aye. From what I make out, what I can, there's three big bugs in Collard Green Station. Overholder's one. Cook, the storekeeper, is another. The third one's Eisenhower. I'd hear what you make of them, William. You're here, Jake said, and thank you, son. He tapped his throat 3 times. Then his seriousness broke into a broad grin, a boy's grin. He urged his horse into a trot, moving up to tell his new friend that yes, he might stay the night. Yes, he could come and play. 4. Holy wow, Eddie said. The words came out low and slow, almost the exclamation of an awestruck cartoon character. But after nearly 2 months in the woods, the view warranted an explanation. And there was the element of surprise. At one moment, they'd just been cropping along the forest trail, mostly by twos. Overholder rode alone at the head of the group, Roland alone at its tail. At the next, the trees were gone, and the land itself fell away to the north, south, and east. They were thus presented with a sudden, breathtaking, stomach-dropping view of the town whose children they were supposed to save. Yet at first, Eddie had no eyes at all for what was spread out directly below him, and when he glanced at Susanna and Jake, he saw they were also looking beyond the column. Eddie didn't have to look around at Roland to know he was looking beyond, too. Definition of a wanderer, Eddie thought. A guy who's always looking beyond. "I quite with you, we tell the gods thank you," Overholder said complacently, and then with a glance at Callahan, "Man Jesus as well, of course. All God is one when it comes to thanks, so I've heard, and 'tis a good enough saying." He might have prattled on. Probably did. When you were the big farmer, you usually got to have your say and all the way to the end. But he took no notice. He had returned his attention to the view. Ahead of them, beyond the village, was a gray band of river running south. The branch of the big river known as Divar-Titi-Hwai, Eddie remembered. Where it came out of the forest, the Divar-Titi ran between steep banks, but they lowered as the river entered the first cultivated field, then fell away entirely. He saw a few stands of palm trees, green and improbably tropical. Beyond the moderate-sized village, the land west of the river was a brilliant green, shot through everywhere with more gray. Eddie was sure that on a sunny day, that gray would turn a brilliant blue, and that when the sun was directly overhead, the gray would be too bright to look at. He was looking at rice fields, or maybe you called them paddies. Beyond them and east of the river was desert, stretching for miles. Eddie could see parallel stretches of metal running into it and made them for railroad tracks. And beyond the desert, or obscuring the rest of it, was simple blackness. It rose into the sky like a vapory wall, seeming to cut into the low-hanging clouds. Down Thunderclap side, Xavier Jeffers said. Eddie nodded. Land of the wolves, and God knows what else. You're a bugger, Whiteman the younger said. He was trying to sound bluff and matter-of-fact, but to Eddie, he looked plenty scared, maybe on the verge of tears. But the wolves wouldn't take him. Surely, if your twin died, that made you a singleton by default, didn't it? Well, it had certainly worked for Elvis Presley. But of course, the king hadn't come from Calabrincid, or even Colorado to the south. No, the king was a Mississippi boy, Eddie said low. Tian turned in his saddle to look at him. Beg your pardon, Si. Eddie, not aware that he'd spoken aloud, said, I'm sorry. I was talking to myself. Andy, the messenger robot, many other functions, came striding back up the path from ahead of them in time to hear this. Those who hold conversation with themselves keep sorry company. This is an old saying of the Kalasai, Eddie. Don't take it personally, I beg. And as I've said before, and will undoubtedly say again, you can't get snot off a suede jacket, my friend. An old saying from Colabrin, Brooklyn. Andy's innards clicked. His blue eyes flashed. Snot. Mucus from the nose. Also, a disrespectful or supercilious person. Suede. This is a leather product which... Never mind, Andy, Susanna said. My friend is just being silly. He does it quite frequently. Oh, yes, Andy said. He is a child of winter. Would you like me to tell your horoscope, Susanna sighed? You will meet a handsome man. You will have two ideas, one bad and one good. You will have a dark-haired... Get out of here, idiot, Overholter said. Right into town, straight line, no wandering. Check that all's well at the pavilion. No one wants to hear your goddamn horoscope. Begging your pardon, old fellow. Callahan made no reply. Andy bowed, tapped his metal throat 3 times, and set off down the trail, which was steep but comfortingly wide. Susanna watched him go with what might have been relief. Kind of hard on him, weren't you? Eddie asked. He's but a piece of machinery, Overholser said, breaking the last word into syllables as if speaking to a child. And he can be annoying, Teen said. But tell me, Size, what do you think of our color? Roland eased his horse in between Eddie and Callahan. It's very beautiful, he said. Whatever the gods may be, they have favored this place. I see corn, chop roots, beans, and potatoes. Are those potatoes? Aye, fudge do you? Fleischman said, clearly pleased by Roland's eye. And yon's all that gorgeous rice, Roland said. All small holes by the river, Tian said, where the water's sweet and slow, and we know how lucky we are. When the rice comes ready, either to plant or to harvest, all the women go together. They're singing in the fields and even dancing. Come, Kamala, Roland said. At least that was what Eddie heard. Tian and Zelia brightened with surprise and recognition. The Fleischmans exchanged a glance and grinned. Where did you hear the rice song? The elder asked. When? In my home, said Roland. Long ago. Come, Kamala, rice, come afala. He pointed to the west, away from the river. There's the biggest farm, deep and wheat. Yours, Sir Overholder? So it is, say thank you. And beyond, to the south, more farms. And then the ranches. That one's cattle, that one's sheep. That one's cattle, more sheep. How can you tell the difference from so far away? Susanna asked. Sheep eat the grass closer to the earth, Lady Side, Overholder said. So where you see the light brown patches of earth, that's sheep grazeland. The others, what you'd call ochre, I guess. That's cattle graze. Eddie thought of all the Western movies he'd seen at the Majestic. Clint Eastwood, Paul Newman, Robert Redford, Lee Van Cleef. In my land, they tell legends of range wars between the ranchers and the sheep farmers, he said, because it was told the sheep ate the grass too close. Took even the roots, you can, so it wouldn't grow back again. That's plain silly, beg your pardon, Overholder said. Sheep do crop grass close, aye, but then we send the cows over it to water. The manure they drop is full of seeds. Ah, Eddie said. He couldn't think of anything else. Put that way, the whole idea of range wars seemed exquisitely stupid. Come on, Overholder said. Daylight's wasting, do you? And there's a feast laid on for us at the pavilion. The whole town will be there to meet you. And to give us a good looking over, too, Eddie thought. Lead on, Roland said. We can be there by late day. Or am I wrong? No, Overholder said, then drove his feet into his horse's sides and yanked his head around. Just looking at this made Eddie weep. He headed down the path. The others followed. 5. Eddie never forgot their first encounter with those of the collar. That was one memory always within his ear. Because everything that happened had been a surprise, he supposed, and when everything's a surprise, experience takes on a dreamlike quality. He remembered the way the torches changed when the speaking was done, their strange, varied lights. He remembered Oi's unexpected salute to the crowd, the upturned faces, and his suffocating panic and his anger at Roland. Susanna hoisting herself onto the piano bench in what the locals called the musical. But even more vivid than this memory of his beloved was that of the gunslinger, of Roland's dancing. But before any of these things came the ride down the College High Street and his sense of foreboding, his premonition of bad days on the way. 6. They reached the town proper an hour before sunset. The crowds parted and let through the day's last red light. The street was empty. The surface was oiled dirt. The horses' hooves made muffled thuds on the wheel-marked hardtack. Eddie saw a livery stable, a place called the Traveler's Rest that seemed a combination lodging house and eating house, and at the far end of the street, a large two-story that just about had to be the college gathering hall. Off to the right of this was the flare of torches, so he supposed there were people waiting there, but at the north end of town, where they entered, there were none. The silence and the empty board sidewalks began to give Eddie the creeps. He remembered Roland's tale of cruising spinal ride into Magus in the back of a cart, standing with her hands tied in front of her and a noose around her neck. Her road had been empty too, at first. Then, not far from the intersection of the Great Road and the Silk Ranch Road, Susan and her captors had passed a single farmer, a man with what Roland had called lamb slaughterer's eyes. Later, he would be pelted with vegetables and sticks, even with stones. But this lone farmer had been first, standing there with his handful of corn shucks, which he had tossed almost gently at her as she passed on her way to, well, on her way to Charges Street, the reap fair of the old people. As they rode into Colibri Figure, Eddie kept expecting that man, those lamb slaughterer's eyes, and a handful of corn shucks. Because this town felt bad to him. Not evil. Evil as Magus had likely been on the night of Susan Delgado's death, but bad in a simpler way. Bad as in bad luck, bad choices, bad omens. Bad car, maybe. He leaned towards Slightman the elder. Where in the heck is everyone, Dan? Yonder, Slightman said, and pointed to the flare of the torches. Why are they so quiet? Jake asked. They don't know what to expect, Callahan said. We're cut off here. The outsiders we do see from time to time are the occasional peddler, harrier, gambler. Oh, and the lake boat march sometimes stop in high summer. What's a lake boat march? Susanna asked. Callahan described a wide flatboat, paddle-wheel driven and gaily painted, covered with small shops. These made their slow way down the Boulevard Petit, stopping to trade at the collars of the middle crescent until their goods were gone. Shoddy stuff for the most part, Callahan said, but Eddie wasn't sure he trusted him entirely, at least on the subject of the lake boat march. He spoke with the almost unconscious distaste of the long-time religious. And the other outsiders come to steal their children, Callahan concluded. He pointed to the left, where a long wooden building seemed to take up almost half the high street. Eddie counted not 2 hitching rails or 4, but 8 long ones. Took General Store. May it be a fine, Callahan said, with what might have been sarcasm. They reached the pavilion. Eddie later put the number present at 700 or 800, but when he first saw them, a mass of hats and bonnets and boots and work-roughened hands beneath the long red light of that day's evening sun, the crowd seemed enormous, untellable. They will throw shit at us, he thought. Throw shit at us and yell salute tree. The idea was ridiculous, but also strong. The collar folks moved back on 2 sides, creating an aisle of green grass which led to a raised wooden platform. Leaving the pavilion with torches caught in iron cages. At that point, they still all flared a quite ordinary yellow. Eddie's nose caught the strong reek of oil. Overholser dismounted. So did the others of his party. Eddie, Susanna, and Jake looked at Roland. Roland sat as he was for a moment, leaning slightly forward, one arm cast across the pommel of his saddle, seeming lost in his own thoughts. Then he took off his hat and held it out to the crowd. He tapped his throat 3 times. The crowd murmured in appreciation or surprise, and he couldn't tell. Not anger, though. Definitely not anger, and that was good. The gunslinger lifted one booted foot across the saddle and lightly dismounted. Eddie left his horse more carefully, aware of all the eyes on him. He put on Susanna's harness earlier, and now he stood next to her mount, back to her. He slipped into the harness with the ease of long practice. The crowd murmured again when they saw her legs were missing from just above the knees. Overholser started briskly up the path, shaking a few hands along the way. Callahan walked directly behind him, occasionally sketching the sign of the cross in the air. Other hands reached out of the crowd to secure the horses. Roland, Eddie, and Jake walked 3 abreast. Hoy was still in the wide front pocket of the poncho Benny had loaned Jake, looking about with interest. Eddie realized he could actually smell the crowd. Sweat and hair and sunburned skin and the occasional splash of what the characters in the Western movies usually called, with contempt similar to Callahan's for the lake boat march, see-through water. He could also smell food, pork and beef, fresh bread, frying onions, coffee and grass. His stomach rumbled, yet he wasn't hungry. No, not really hungry. The idea that the path they were walking would disappear and these people would close in on them wouldn't leave his mind. It was so quiet. Somewhere close by, he could hear the first night jars and whippoorwills tuning up for evening. Overholser and Callahan mounted the platform. Eddie was alarmed to see that none of the others of the party which had ridden out to meet them did. Roland walked up the 3 broad wooden steps without hesitation, however. Eddie followed, conscious that his knees were a little weak. "You all right?" Susanna murmured in his ear. So far. To the left of the platform was a round stage with 7 men on it, all dressed in white shirts, blue jeans, and socks. Eddie recognized the instruments they were holding, and although the mandolin and banjo made him think their music would probably be of the shit-kicking variety, the sight of them was still reassuring. They didn't hire bands to play at human sacrifices, did they? Maybe just a drummer or two to wind up the spectators. Eddie turned to face the crowd, with Susanna on his back. He was dismayed to see that the aisle that had begun where the high street ended was indeed gone. Faces tilted up to look at him. Women and men, old and young. No expression on those faces, and no children among them. These were faces that spent most of their time out in the sun and had the cracks to prove it. That sense of foreboding was not leaving. Overholder stopped beside a plain wooden table. On it was a large, billowy feather. The farmer took it and held it up. The crowd, quiet to begin with, now fell into a silence so disquietingly deep that Eddie could hear the rattling wails in some old party's chest as he or she breathed. "Put me down, Eddie," Susanna said quietly. He didn't like to, but he did. "I'm Wayne Overholder of 7 Mile Park," Overholder said, stepping to the edge of the stage with the feather held before him. "Hear me now, I beg. We say thank you, Si." Amen. Overholder turned and held one hand out to Roland and his pet, standing there in their travel-stained clothes. Susanna didn't stand exactly, but rested between Eddie and Jake on her haunches and one propped hand. Eddie thought he had never felt himself studied more eagerly. "We men of the collar heard T. and Jefford, George Telford, Diego Adams, and all others who would speak at the gathering hall," Overholder said. "There I did speak myself. They'll come and take the children, I said, meaning the wolves, of course. Then they'll leave us alone again for a generation or more. So it is, so it's been. I say leave it alone. I think now those words were mayhap a little hasty." A murmur from the crowd, soft as a breeze. "At this same meeting, we heard Per Callahan say there were gunslingers north of us." Another murmur. This one was a little louder. "Gunslingers, mid-world, Gilead. It was taken among us that a party should go and see. These are the folk we found, do you? They claim to be what Per Callahan said they were." Overholder now looked uncomfortable, almost as if he was suppressing a thought. Eddie had seen this expression before, mostly on TV, when politicians, faced with some facts they couldn't squirm around, were forced to backtrack. "They claim to be of the gone world, which is to say—" "Go on, Wayne," Eddie thought. "Get it out. You can do it." "Which is to say, of Eld's line." "God be praised," some woman shrieked. "God that sent him to save our baddies, so they have." There was shushing sound. Overholder waited for quiet with a pained look on his face, then went on. "They can speak for themselves, and must. But I've seen enough to believe they may be able to help us with our problem. They carry good guns, you see them, and they can use them. Set my watch and warrant on it and say thank you." This time the murmur from the crowd was louder, and Eddie sensed goodwill in it. He relaxed a little. "All right, then. Let them stand before you one by one, that you might hear their voices and see their faces very well. This is their dean." He lifted a hand to Roland. The gunslinger stepped forward. The red sun set his left cheek on fire. The right was painted yellow with torch glow. He put out one leg. The thunk of the worn boot heel on the board was very clear in the silence. Eddie, for no reason, thought of a fist knocking on a coffin top. He bowed deeply, open palms held after him. "Roland of Gilead, son of Stephen," he said. "The line of Eld." They